Okay, I'd like to call the Environmental Commission regular meeting to order at 6:31. Okay, can we do roll call, please?
Yes. The chair position is open. Vice Chair Serafin.
Here.
Secretary Sharma here. Alderman Craig.
Here.
Commissioner Suhaisik. Absent. Commissioner Valdez.
Here.
Let's stand and do the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, I'd like to open the citizen comment period at 6:32. I see we do have citizens, so please introduce yourself. Yeah. Hi. Oh, maybe Marion has.
It says
The green light, but I also have to turn it on.
Ah, okay. With your master powers there.
Yeah.
My name is Andy Pelkey, and I live at 9320 West Grandview Court, and I'm here to talk about buckthorn. I've brought this issue up before. I read your survey results on buckthorn, and I thought they were very positive. There was a graph that showed that 1/4 of the people surveyed needed more information. 3/4 had enough to make a decision. 1/4 of those, 3/4, which is a third, said no, and the other 2/3 said yes. So to me, that's strong backing from the educated electorate or the educated citizens that some kind of curb on buckthorn is acceptable. You all know, and I know, what happens when you let an invasive species just go. It's invasive, so it's just going to go wild, and that's what's happened. So I'm here just to say that I'm, hoping that somebody will take those survey results, take them for what they are, and get the job done, drive the thing home. Let's have some sort of even a medium step on it. For example, some people objected because of the cost to remove the buckthorn. Okay, great. So let's just start with something simple. Within 50 feet of your boundaries of your property, you got to get rid of buckthorn, 50 feet. And if you can't afford it, you can apply for some sort of hardship waiver. Maybe we have some volunteers which will help get the buckthorn out for somebody who can't afford it. I mean, something. I just feel like it's time to take a step here instead of just doing nothing. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Excuse me. I'm sorry. Can I get your last name? I didn't. Sorry about that.
It's Pelkey. Pelkey. 9320 West Grandview Court.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Okay, you should do officers next.
Okay, so do I close the comment period?
Well, if there's no one else, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so citizen comment period ends at 6:35. Okay. Before I approve the minutes, we should ask for approval of minutes. We will go to elected officials. You want to, Marion? Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah. I mean, so you are for clarification for the room and for the record, the Amy Serafin is the current vice chair, and so she is the acting chair in the absence of a chair. You're also supposed to appoint new officers today, and it would be appropriate to do that before the rest of the meeting's business commences, just so there's clarity about who's doing what. So we do need someone to nominate, and then the elected chair would then appoint a secretary. So.
Okay. Does anybody want to nominate a chair?
I'll nominate you. Vice Chair Serafin.
We need a chair, a vice chair, and a secretary. So.
Do you have any interest?
Me?
Yeah.
No, thank you.
Okay.
What does it consist of?
Yeah.
You kind of run the meeting.
Okay.
Where everything kind of like a hockey ref. You kind of keep things moving.
Sure, I gotcha.
And so it doesn't.
Is there a lot of out of here stuff you got to do, or is it?
I don't
pretty-
believe so.
Okay.
No, so the chair of this commission does draft the agenda.
Okay.
And they run the meeting. So
And
the
then run-
drafting of the agenda
Okay.
will become that person's responsibility, but I collaborate with them. So if depending on what items the commission suggests, if there's requests from the public or legislative items, the planning department assists with that. And then we produce the packets,
Sure.
which are then distributed. So effectively, you're responsible for calling the meetings, but this commission actually selects a group of meeting dates each year.
Okay.
So,
We'll help whatever you guys need help with. So.
yeah, so it's whoever wants to be the chair, the vice chair, and
Are
then,
you interested in the chair?
It'd be kind of cool. I don't know.
Yeah.
Sure, I guess. If
I'm-
you guys don't want to do it.
I would just prefer to stay as vice chair.
this is the commission's decision.
So-
You guys, yeah, I don't mind at
Okay,
all.
That's
Yeah.
fine. So I would like to.
Jesse Valdez.
Yep.
Nominate Jesse Valdez to the
Go ahead.
position of chair.
I second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Do you accept the nomination?
Yes.
Okay. Now,
You
All
can
in
vote
are
for
any other
Sure. S I maybe whatever.
or any other? Do you mind if I?
Go ahead.
Any other nominations for the role of chair of the Environmental Commission?
No.
Seeing none, unanimous consent goes to Jesse to become the new.
Are you sure? Anyway,
Really, Marion? Serious?
what?
I'm good.
Okay.
Very
Yeah.
good.
This is nothing new to me. So
Great.
Okay.
Congratulations.
thank
sir.
you.
Congratulations.
Open
We need the vice chair.
any nominations for the role of vice chair for the Environmental Commission.
I nominate Vice Chair Serafin.
Do you accept the nomination?
I do.
Any other nominations for vice chair? Seeing none, unanimous consent. Congratulations, Vice Chair Serafin.
Thank you.
And the commissioner, or the chair, would you like to appoint a secretary?
I'm gonna botch the
That's all
pronunciation.
right.
Mr. Sharman.
Yes.
Yes.
I accept.
Fantastic.
Thanks, guys.
Yes.
Sure enough. It is your show now, sir.
All right.
Yep. So at your seats, there is a proposed agenda because on this evening's meeting, we have new business. And under new business, there is the UDO item. So I would like to request that we take that item first because there is a presentation from Birchline Planning. And Julie Beth's time is valuable. So if you don't mind, it would be helpful to allow her to go first.
Sure. We can do that then.
Are you good, Julie, Beth, JB?
Yes, absolutely. And please don't let me impose because I'm very, very sorry that I'm not able to be with you in person. I had every intention until I got a phone call at 7:00 yesterday morning that my mom was on the way to the ER. So I am not with you, but really have enjoyed working on this. So yeah, I'm good to go.
You should be able to share. If I will let you know if they can't see what you're doing. My computer is really misbehaving today, so.
All right, let's see how we're doing. Okay, looks like that is screen sharing. Everybody see that?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. So what I wanted to do, first of all, thank you all for your time and your availability to talk about this part of the Unified Development Ordinance or UDO update. So I'm Julie Beth Hines. I go by JB. I am a planner by training. I have deep roots in Wisconsin and I've worked with something like 32 Wisconsin communities on zoning, also stormwater management, public outreach, all kinds of things, usually related to, as my daughter famously said, I go to meetings, I say boring things about water and money. So we have been working with Houseo Levine and your wonderful staff on a comprehensive update to the UDO, which is Franklin's zoning and subdivision put together. And my charge has been, to a very large extent, to work on the natural resource mitigation, natural resource standards, and in particular, the way that the city has been doing mitigation when development, redevelopment happen that have impacts on certain natural resources. So what I thought we would do, and please stop me anytime. I can't see you, so if there are looks of puzzlement or something, just interrupt me. I thought it'd be great if we could just sort of walk through the chunks that are in this memo together and talk about what some of the critical issues are and where your feedback would be really helpful. So, starting out, I've worked with all 28 of the jurisdictions that are in the Milwaukee Metro Sewerage District on, I have read all of those zoning codes. I have sat with public works and planning staff over the last, actually, 12 years now. And when you talk about natural resource protection, Franklin always comes up as the city that has sort of been the most active and the most intentional about preventing impacts on natural resources, in part because of the Root River and the Oak Savannah complex. And there have been some real upsides to that as development, especially residential development, has occurred. When we started the UDO update, what we started with were some interviews of people within the city and outside the city who used the Unified Development Ordinance, not only developers, but also their consultants, many of whom I work with in other contexts, who I know to be really responsible people who have a lot of care about wetlands, shoreline wetlands, forest resources, etc. What we discovered in doing that fact-finding is that there really is there are some elements of the current resource plan structure, and especially the process, and I'm going to go to page 3 now, that are not achieving the kinds of desirable benefits or are leading to protracted development review process, confusion over who has authority, what do you do if you need an exception, et cetera, that have been really frustrating both to staff and to landowners and their applicants. There are also a couple of elements of the natural resource protection that are just sort of organized in a wonky way. And then there are some technical issues about what resources do we mitigate and how. So, and again, I'm going to pause and take a breath. Please interrupt with, barbed remarks and pithy observations whenever you need to. So the current structure of the natural resource plan, and I'm just going to shut a door real quick. Come on in. So the current structure of the code, and I'm looking at a screen over to the right, is basically requires preparation of a natural resource protection plan, or NRPP, goes first to Marion as staff, for any project that takes place on land containing and that contains any of these fixtures. And here are the 7 things that are defined. Steep slopes, which is land ranging from anywhere from 10 to 30% grade. There's not a lot of it in Franklin. Then we have mature and young woodlands, which are defined based on the percent of trees and woody vegetation at certain sizes. And I want to come back to that because that's really important, especially with what our citizen comment just was. Lakes, ponds, and streams are protected. Shoreline buffers, as defined in statute. Floodplains and floodways, wetlands and shoreland wetlands, and then wetland buffers. Okay. And right now, today, what the city does under the UDO is you take a site plan and you have to factor out the land area that's in one or more of those natural resources, and that is subtracted from your land area on which the city calculates allowable density. And today that is density of non-residential use and number of dwelling units. Then if there's any land disturbance that affects one or more of those resources, the Natural Resource Protection Plan has to be prepared, and that is usually by a wetland, either a wetlands consultant or professional engineer or both. In Wisconsin, the term is an assured delineator who has met certain state criteria and registration. And then any of those impacts have to be mitigated. And they have to be mitigated today, for the most part, on site. So if, in particular, a wetland is affected by a development that's approved, a compensatory area of wetland has to be created on site to offset that impact, unless council generally approves some kind of waiver or reduction in that mitigation. And one of the things I want to point out is that mitigation of, for example, woodlands, wetlands, it doesn't matter what type of resource is affected, and it doesn't matter where in the city that's occurring, if it's occurring in a redevelopment setting or if it's new development out in the southwest portion in the Oak Savannah. It doesn't matter if it's buckthorn that we're removing as woody vegetation. That counts as a woodland. You got to mitigate for any removal. So what we heard from stakeholders is that the language is kind of a blunt instrument from that standpoint. And three particular substantive issues that I think are really directly relevant to our environmental commission and the city's priorities. The first is dealing with wetlands on redevelopment sites. So think of, any of the shopping centers, sites along, what would be a good example, Marion? Sites where you've, for example, had an older development. The parking lot created a wetland in the back because it was badly drained, and then there's a redevelopment of that site.
Anywhere in the 27th Street corridor, especially the northeast, yeah.
Absolutely. Anywhere along 27th Street is just a really good example of this. Creating a wetland on a site that is previously disturbed is not likely to achieve good results because of the need for hydrology, for certain soil types that where a wetland wants to be. But the city has had a number of instances where wetlands have had to be created in places where the wetland doesn't really want to be in order to meet that mitigation standard. The definition of woodlands and the mitigation for woodland impacts does not distinguish right now between high value trees or even that very special resource, the Oak Savannah complex, and ash and buckthorn. So right now, even those things, if you read the code strictly, or you don't get that, if you don't get that exception from the city, you could be mitigating for stuff that we really probably want out of there. And that has led to a lot of confusion. How do we calculate? Do we get a pass if we're removing buckthorn? And then a third one is, and these are numbered 3, 4, 5. Okay, thanks, Microsoft Word. The third one, and an area where I think there's room to really enhance the environmental resources in Franklin, is that right now, if you develop, say, within 50 feet of the edge of a wetland, within that wetland buffer, you have to mitigate for that impact, but you don't necessarily have to establish a really well-vegetated permanent buffer on that water resource. And so that kind of undermines the benefit of doing that mitigation. Or avoid, what we really want. We want to avoid impacts, but we also want to establish much dense, effective vegetative buffer as possible along these water resources. So those were three really kind of critical technical issues. And then it was sort of like organization, process, technical knowledge in terms of the process of developing the plans and then saying yes or no, like, yes, this is a good plan. this meets the city's objectives. In a lot of cases, there's confusion. Well, is it the plan commission that gets to say that it's complete? Is it staff? Is it council? How do we get the right people with the right skills to review on behalf of the city? And that can just lead to uncertainty in review, which doesn't really help anyone. So I want to pause. Any questions, or Marion, do you want to make any comments or clarifications on the existing NRPPs and structure?
I have a question, just from a practicality standpoint, with the changes and kind of seeing this kind of highlighted as far as like, this is vague, it isn't well defined. I think this does help quite a bit as far as, setting those limits and being able to give people better direction. My question then would be, at what point then would someone still be able to operate under the old existing code versus an adoption of the new UDO? And how would that affect someone that would still be in pre-planning that's been already approved for along in the process of a development, where I don't want there to be this extraordinary chaos because, we changed the rules of the game in the middle of the third quarter. Mm-hmm. I think that would be very, very, that becomes an undue burden upon like a developer or a homeowner that wants to, do something particular with their property. So I don't know if you can kind of speak to that at all or no.
I can answer
Yes.
that, or you
Yeah.
can, JB.
Marion.
Basically,
Marion.
so the UDO process has come before Common Council a few times. The task force is at Plan Commission, and they're doing a review process now. But until the ordinance is in force, meaning it has been adopted by Common Council, and this specific section in and of itself will be part of that. Until it isn't in force, any application received prior to that adoption date will be evaluated under the old ordinances.
Okay.
And that's the case for the whole project. So as we look at plats and other kinds of development reviews, the application date and receipt date will be what counts. We're hoping to.
And that was
Yeah.
my question of like,
Yep.
is it on the adoption date? Is it on
Mm-hmm.
review by staff? Is it on approval by plan commission? Like which date along the process?
It'll be that Common Council adoption date when the ordinance is adopted.
Okay.
Because there will be an ordinance.
Great.
And JB has given a good set of background for this. I'm going to briefly canvass after her presentation and before the natural resource special exception this evening some of the existing ordinances. But what she's referring to broadly is a document called a Natural Resource Protection Plan, which is produced by an engineer, usually in concert with a biologist or a wetland biologist and other professionals in that field. And what we require now is it's almost all pieces of it are evaluated by the area of the thing. Is it 1.5 acres of wetland? Is it, 8 trees or however many square feet of trees? It does not distinguish between a farmed wetland and one that has high quality plants in it. It does, or even really an artificially created one. It does not distinguish between the oak savanna and it does distinguish between landscaping. So if someone has installed landscaping, that would not be included typically. But the oak savanna and a couple of aspens in the middle of a field. So we're proposing to clarify the requirements for that drawing and also structure better the way in which we apply them. So there's a lot of things currently in the ordinance that are overly broad that we hope to clean up a little bit. And also, for those of you that have worked with the ordinance, these pieces that you guys use as part of your structure to evaluate these applications is just spread all the way out through the UDO, the Unified Development Ordinance. So it's part 4, it's part 7, it's difficult to interpret. You can't always find what you're looking for. It's difficult to communicate to developers. So I appreciate the comment from Alderman Craig because the goal here is to create clarity for staff, for developers, for the general public. So, and you guys are kind of the the intermediary between that, where you have expertise, but you're also members of the general public. So we're seeking your feedback so that, is something confusing? Is it not well phrased, that kind of thing. So, and then JB has, significant background to kind of say, here's the sciencey part in layman's terms. Here's where we're trying to get. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Great. All right. Thank you, Marion. That's really helpful. And I think that gives you the context of what the Environmental Commission has done, your role, City Council's role, et cetera. So proposal. The proposal is to, I think the first and most significant that will kind of help is to change up a little tiny bit how those protected areas are defined. And the first way that staff has recommended, and your fearless consultants have recommended we do that, is by including sewer packs, primary and secondary environmental corridors, and their isolated natural resource areas. Those are well defined. They tend to have areas of overlapping resources, and by saying new development, we're gonna make those a protected area, you kind of kill. I don't like to kill birds. You kind of knock off several loads of laundry in one load. You get some colors, you get some whites, and it all goes in the wash together in a good way. So that would be a change. And the sewer pack maps would be used to identify those areas. And that also helps with, those are clear. We have experts over at the Regional Planning Commission who maintain that. And it protects groupings of resources with my dumb laundry example. We think that will really facilitate project review and cut down the cost to applicants to have to go out and identify all these different resources. If we know it's a sewer pack corridor, that's defined well already. The second thing is through what we're calling the mitigation guide, to differentiate, like Marion just said, between the setting of some of these resources and the value. So that we can make sure that mitigation investments are consistent with the type of resource affected, and also that they're not necessarily that your options for mitigation include some things other than particularly either trying to replant trees and species in places they don't want to be, or trying to put a new wetland on a site where it really doesn't want to be. That is expensive, and I'm older than I act, and I've seen that fail over and over. So 2 and 3 are really about options that are appropriate to the ecology. And 4 is to really start to have a new surface water and wetland buffer standard that says, okay, we're going to do the development review process, but regardless of whether you've affected a resource, if you've got surface water buffer or wetland buffer on your property, we want it planted and demarcated so it doesn't become lawn or doesn't get sort of, accidentally paved, or we've got clearing or material storage going on there, which is what's actively damaging both to water quality but also to flood storage. So I think that could be a real win that doesn't really change the game for development or people's development capacity, but it says we're going to put up a buffer, we're going to mark the buffer, and we're going to plant inside it, and it's not the place to store all your stuff. And then 5 and 6 is really about technical guidance and review, and this is really where you and your wonderful staff can work through who should be reviewing what in what order and with what potential for support. And our team has a meeting coming up in July on administrative procedures where we're really trying to make that as clear and streamlined as possible. So the draft that we sent out takes, like Marion said, we've got chunks of Article 3, 4, 7, and 9 that address natural resources, and the draft kind of sticks them all in 7. Um, and that, so I've highlighted here, starting this is page 5 into 6, sort of what the purpose is of each of the sections in the new draft of Article 7. And to the gentleman who spoke earlier about buckthorn, 7.01 has a specific set of language that would authorize invasives removal, which currently really, from a technical reading of the ordinance, would count as impacts to a woodland on all but single and two-family lots, that clearing invasives or low-value trees is permitted probably on issuance of something like a zoning permit, so that we don't get people clear cutting, but we can get those invasive removals done with a simple ministerial permit, and make it really clear that that is not protected. 7.02 is how to determine the features. And again, we're going to lean on Sewer Pack because that, we've got a regional commission that does high quality science. Let's use that. And then it directs the definition of woodland forest, except again, for those invasive and low value species. Surface waters are pretty straightforward, and shoreline wetlands, which are almost certainly not going to be an issue in Franklin. That's something you should worry about if you are, Manitowoc, and not so much here. One important change, though, is that there would no longer try to be this calculation and factoring of either regulatory floodplains or steep slopes. And the sense from staff, from Sewer Pack staff, from applicants that we've talked to in this process, is the requirement to mitigate floodplains was just conflicted with the application of the floodplain ordinance, which is being updated as part of this UDO process. And that the idea of mitigating steep slopes has led to a lot of consternation and not much benefit over the years. So those would no longer need to be, obviously they have to be identified on any site plan, but they don't have to be identified as resources or mitigated anymore. Floodplains, got it, if you're going to affect a floodplain, you really need to go there. That's going to be handled under the floodplain ordinance, so we're not trying to do the same thing twice. Okay. And then woodland, based on some work that I'm doing up north, I've been working with Douglas and Bayside or Bayfield counties. We'd recommend defining woodland / forest as defined in the Wisconsin Forest Management Manual. That is a little bit different than the current definition on that I copied on page 1. It's more about the structure of the wooded area and less about, well, how many trees of what size? Because the how many trees of what size is currently counting ash trees and buckthorn. So in this case, you'd basically be asking the delineator to identify which areas are structured as woodland or forest on this site. Any questions?
I have a
I'll
couple
just say-
questions.
Yes.
This is Commissioner Amy Seraphim, so go ahead and ask your questions, but I think you'll be interested to know that Ms. Seraphim has a background in environmental sciences. So
Maybe these are simple, and they might be for you, Marion.
Mhm.
Do we have an overlay of the it's a terrible name,
Sewer Pack.
Sewer Pack, the Southeastern Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission's natural resource corridors on
Mhm.
our zone, on Franklin, to see where that's at, like overlaid on the zoning map? And likewise, the floodplain overlay. Do we have those
Yep.
overlays so we could look at, because part of what we're also doing, not in this meeting, but is rezoning and redefining how and consolidating a lot of different zoning types of zoning into smaller units, so we don't have 50 zones in Franklin, right?
Yep.
So, do we have that? Have we looked at these, and can I get a copy of them? Because I think that would be beneficial when we talk about these things to see what is this corridor and what is this floodplain on our map. What areas are these? And then as we're changing the zoning from one to another, what's impacted by that? Maybe nothing, but I would be surprised.
So, yes and yes to the mapping information. So the sewer pack maps are determined by sewer pack. We don't have them in a public-facing GIS system right now, but that's something that I can send along to you. And there's something that we would say to the applicant: you must check with sewer pack about the boundaries of this, because they do occasionally change them. So keeping that mapping up to date we'd make sure that they're doing whatever's most current according to sewer pack. Their information is public facing. In terms of the location of the floodplain, that information is currently on our public facing GIS. There is the federal insurance rate maps, the firm panels. Those are available. They're a layer. So currently we have a section in our current zoning ordinance that regulates the floodway, one for flood fringe. There's a few other different categories in the zoning ordinance that are different from the floodplain ordinance, which is appended to our existing zoning ordinance. The future, we kind of got into this, the future ordinance will do that as well. There actually hasn't been any changes to the location of the firm, the boundaries of that map either. So if you look at the
and I'm not concerned about changes to the boundaries of that map. I would just like to look at that map overlay, that GIS overlay, on the proposed zoning changes and see where, this border of the floodplain is in this lot that's zoned agriculture, and we're changing it to light manufacturing. So that can be allowed, but if we're trying to look at things more comprehensively, I think we need to see this, like what I hear you saying, JB, is we're trying to have higher quality natural resource areas in exchange for lifting up all of these detailed reviews and requirements on every individual parcel, right? So if that's the goal.
No, I wouldn't say so. I would not put it that way.
Okay, yeah.
The goal is that the natural resource standards would still apply to all parcels in the city, regardless of their zoning designation. That does not change. That's not proposed to change at all. The natural resource standards would still apply regardless of underlying zoning district. So what would change here specifically is instead of each resource needing to be defined on any development parcel individually, we're going to use the sewer pack corridors as a proxy for all the different resources that we know are in each of those corridors. But there's no proposed change to the applicability of the natural resource standards. These would still apply regardless of the underlying zoning district.
Yeah, they layer together. So the use
Yeah,
of the signs,
and I think I understood that. I guess, I think it would still be helpful to see a visual of that.
Yeah, I concur, and I will say on upcoming agenda, I plan to bring you an item about the federal insurance rate maps and the update process, which is a little bit, it's part of the UDO update in terms of that we're looking at it but we're required to adopt that new ordinance before we'll be completing the overall update. So we'll be getting a look at the draft probably at your.
And just one more comment, kind of what is driving my thinking, and I I apologize, it's not completely thought through, is what we see in this committee with special exception stuff is currently based on a lot by lot request. And so we're provided the information and pretty detailed information about the lot and maybe a little bit of the surrounding area, like that touches that lot. But we're not provided an overall big picture of how that, the special exception that we're being asked to approve influences the entirety of Franklin's natural resources. So we operate in a piece-by-piece basis, which we all have acknowledged on this committee, except for our new chair, who's new, that is part of the struggle and the problem that we have when we get these individual requests, right? So and I'm not saying this has to be done within the UDO. I understand that we will have a mitigation document that is separate from it. But I think that it relates to the decision-making process for the UDO in the same way for that reason.
Right. I mean, it is the nature of a unified development ordinance that it's a set of standards for the voluntarily initiated changes in land use. It's not a comprehensive plan. It's not a capital improvement program. There will always be a piece-by-piece element because people have rights in land under the UDO and choose what to do when of their own volition. The mitigation guide is intended to give you some ways, and we'll talk about that, to look at, well, given this voluntary action that would be permitted, what are the options we have for offsetting or enhancing any impacts, and would open it up to a larger citywide discussion of where could things happen. You're still going to be up against, well, they're only asking for this parcel because that's the only land the person controls. You're still going to be up against, you can't force people to make deals to mitigate on adjacent properties if there's not a willing landowner. But hopefully it can open up some more possibilities to be more creative and look more broadly at impacts.
Yes. I understand. I agree. Would still like to look at it. Thank you.
Of course.
Okay.
And I will just say too, the comprehensive master plan is our next sort of department project, and there is a section in it which is specific to natural resources. So the UDO project is a big project, as you've seen. But when we start working on that, your input as a collective will be essential to making sure that all
And
of
will
that
the
makes sense.
UDO be used also as an essential tool in that?
So
It's separate. A development ordinance is zoning. This is, allowability of use, intensity, and management standards. So ideally, a comprehensive plan is done before you do a UDO update. For complicated reasons, that didn't happen here. But you don't use zoning to do citywide resource planning, right? You would do citywide resource planning, and then if you need to revisit something in those implementing regulations, the UDO, then you might make changes to the UDO.
Yep. So with the resources that we have in terms of best available information for the update of these maps, we're using the flood insurance maps as the overlay. Sewer pack is kind of a proxy for some of that because they truly do. I mean, just for the whole region, they have come out here and physically mapped wetlands. They have determined where these essential, what are the protected corridors are. You probably know all the terminology. So given that, it's appropriate to include that in the zoning ordinance because they've already done the science. So.
Right. And it's, I think it gives the city a much stronger position than hoping the property owners, delineators got everything. Now you're saying, okay, these are regionally recognized resources. We know they're there. So that and floodplain, I don't know, Marion, it might be good to have a separate working session on the floodplain ordinance update.
Yes, let's discuss that. I have a draft, but I was intending to do that at their next meeting.
Great.
So the other thing about the sewer pack categories is that they're actually based on how interconnected some of those areas are. So they have those categories of isolated, secondary. The all primary is the floodplain. So if it's a primary environmental corridor, it's likely to have floodway on it. So yeah, they think about that interconnected piece. So I hear you that it would be great to do that bigger thinking, but unfortunately the focus of this project is kind of the development standards. So
Okay. So the next, a pretty big change that's in this proposed draft would be to actively exempt those wetlands that meet the state's definition, the DNR definition of artificial wetlands and degraded wetlands. And these would have to be established site by site by an assured delineator. You wouldn't accept anything less than an assured delineator's signed professional judgment on this. And not, in fact, to require creation of new wetlands on the same site, and especially not to require creation of 1.5 times the area affected, which is, some really smart folks who've dealt with Franklin have tried to do that. There's a lot of expense involved, and there's not much environmental benefit. And here is where I want to talk about the idea of doing a mitigation guide. Can you guys still see my screen?
yes.
Okay, it's not my dog up behind my mom's house. Okay. So this is our very drafty outline that I included. And this is the purpose here would be to provide options. So if in fact, and we're defining what the protected ones are with links, and then to give people ways to calculate the impact, which is done today, and then to come up with options for mitigation planning. And some of the thinking is, and we'd like your input on that, some of the options that could be in that mitigation guide would include creating new green stormwater infrastructure. And here I would really recommend that we use MMSD's recognized types and standards for the creation of green stormwater infrastructure. Supplemental tree planting. If you've got a site where there's an absence of canopy and you've got soils and soils and a solar orientation that could support more canopy trees, that has water quality and flood control and heat benefits. I would also recommend, and here again, MMSD has really good technical standards and guidance. Instead of trying to create a new wetland, take out excess asphalt, excess impervious area, and revegetate that to the MMSD standard for native planting and amended soil. Another thing that we did in the city of Milwaukee to require sort of a best fix is to give people an option instead of trying, again, to create something that doesn't want to be there. If you have a cruddy landscaped area, like a parking lot perimeter, dig that out and replant it as green infrastructure. Or at the very least, replant it with significant soil and native plants so that we get some habitat benefit, we get some better soil structure instead of janky grass in a parking lot island. So that is the idea, that there could be a menu of options backed by a technical standard appropriate to this region and well tested, so that if you're going to affect a degraded wetland, there's no expectation that you would recreate that wetland function. there would be an expectation you do probably 1.5 times that area with green practices that are suitable for your site and an urban environment. So that's the guts of our intent in starting to draft the mitigation guide. And I did want to make sure, I did want to get your open, honest comments on how does that feel as an approach to some of that resource mitigation? Because this has been the degraded wetlands, the funky wetlands in urban settings. That has been the place where, from everything we got in our research process, has been the most difficult. That and why are you making me mitigate buckthorn? I thought I was doing the right thing, so.
Has there been a heavy adoption rate on certain, when you talk about options, and I like the idea of being able to not say you have to plant X, Y, or Z and, forcing someone to do that. But I also am sensitive to the fact that, a developer may not want to go with something that they view as too costly, and where that might be the right choice, it may not be the right economic choice.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense at all?
It does.
Do you see where having the A, B, and C being options for a developer to, because of a degraded area or because of the wetland being the area that's most affected, that they would say, well, you know what, that's fine. I can do X because the cost of X is so much less than what I would have to do otherwise, that this is just a smart business decision on my end. And
Right.
That gives me a little bit of concern.
Okay. Great question, and really important to talk that through. I appreciate that you've raised that. The cheapest thing from a natural resource standpoint is always to avoid and leave things alone. If you don't affect it, you don't have to mitigate it. But of course, that's balanced against the value of urban redevelopment, not only economic, but to the community in jobs and tax value and vibrant community. So I can tell you from personal experience, working in real estate over the years and working with MMSD on the Green Infrastructure Partnership Program, there is nothing more expensive than trying to make a developer create new wetland. And that is part of the reason there's been a lot of pushback against Franklin's regs. It's soils and grading and hydrology and all kinds of things. That is the most expensive thing you could make an applicant do. In terms of sort of creating new green infrastructure, supplemental trees, revegetation, MMSD actually did this along with, what is the matter with me? Sweetwater. Sorry, my brain just left the station for a sec. I did this along with Sweetwater and MMSD. We went back through and did a cost study in 2019 of how much does it cost a developer or a city to install these green infrastructure practices versus other approaches like vegetation. And we got really good data on cost of landscaping, engineered soil, native plants, trees, etc. The way that, and we went through the bid tabs of like 85 projects, and we had a couple of developer forums where we ground truth that data. And the way to keep things realistic from a cost standpoint is not to over specify tree species, plant species, and to have things in that mitigation arsenal that are realistically available in Southeast Wisconsin. So I think so long as we really stick to options that we know are available, rather than you've got to do, a mix of 18 different plants that all have to be ordered from Applied Ecological or Broadleaf out in Madison and jack up the price. straightforward green infrastructure and plantings that we know are realistic in the region, and we know the cost ranges. So we're not inventing things for people to do that go beyond and really do create unnecessary cost.
Okay.
So, but anything is cheaper than trying to reconstruct a wetland where it doesn't want to be. That's just from my years in the public sector. That was about the most expensive thing we could do.
Got it. Thank you.
So I would love you all to think about and comment on where and what types of sort of landscape and environmental enhancements you believe would have value. The two most likely things to have to be mitigated in Franklin are going to be forest or woodland and wetlands. The real hope is that through doing these standards that we strongly discourage development or development impacts on those sewer pack primary, secondary corridors. Because that will protect the oak savanna, among other things. But where there are going to be, site changes that affect a resource, what kind of tree planting or where would you all see as valuable? Where are some areas that you think green infrastructure or just cleaning up and improving the quality of landscape could be beneficial in Franklin? Are there areas that need shade that would be good to have as samples or options for folks who are going to need to do some mitigation? Any and all of that can go right in the mitigation guide and then come to the top as options. What we've seen around Milwaukee is there's plenty of old cruddy pavement that we do not need that can be pulled up, revegetated, and give us an environmental win. So that should be a pretty straightforward. That ought to be a no-brainer for a lot of sites. But I'd love your input on what else would be, in your experience and knowledge, beneficial. And it doesn't all have to be tonight, but that would be really great. The other bit is, and I think all of you can really help speak to this, the administrative procedures. Who should review what plans for what elements? As Marion said, the sort of sciencey stuff, it's not been entirely clear what body gets to say, yes, this is an appropriate wetland delineation and this mitigation plan works and really meets the spirit and intent of our UDO. And sometimes that's been debated in the court of public opinion as well, and that tends to be challenging. One piece that I put in the draft that when I was a planning director saved my butt over and over was language that would allow the city to do an independent third-party review at the applicant's expense but the city's direction of a specific technical issue. For example, say you get something in that says, this is a degraded wetland, and we plan to mitigate that with this green stormwater infrastructure in this location. And Marion looks at it and says, uh-oh, I'm really not sure about this. And Glenn's on vacation. I'd like a third party to review this for technical adequacy. That would be authorized here. I've found that to be really helpful when used in a strategic and limited way. I think it can end up saving applicants money rather than bringing their consultant to 6 meetings. So that is in the draft. And then I think, Marion, anything else you want to say on the review process of like who would certify what at what stage is something that we're working through as a team right now.
Mm-hmm. So currently the review and approval process for a natural resource special exception, and I want to be clear that that's a variance. So it's someone asking to do something that exceeds what they could do without extra permission. So as JB talked about earlier, the cheapest option is always to not impact natural resources. Someone who's coming forward with a variance has a legitimate reason or a reason that they believe to be legitimate to make that request. So currently, those reviews go to this commission first, and you make a recommendation to Plan Commission, which then makes a recommendation to Common Council. There's also a public hearing, which is a requirement of our ordinances. That happens at Plan Commission. I think the public hearing is essential, and it's something that won't go away because it is a variance. Those are required anyway by the state. But I don't know that it's essential for this review to go to Common Council to be decided. So you could eliminate a meeting and say that Plan Commission as the land use authority is able to make that decision. They're able to make other kinds of decisions as well. And that you have control over recommendations for things like mitigation. So one of the things that we've seen moving through the process is that you will make a recommendation with recommended conditions of approval, and a decision, you make a recommendation as a body on a mitigation plan, and then that plan changes sometimes dramatically as it filters up through all of that discussion. But that mitigation plan, as the experts, that be something that you have a recommending power over. The other thing is that currently Plan Commission has the ability to require bonding for that work. So they're saying someone will put forward a financial surety. It's not always required, but it's typically required. There's not standards for it in our ordinances, but Plan Commission has the power to do that, and where that power lies could also change. So these are some things to think about, because I think for you as a body, I've seen significant changes in recommendations and the ultimate decision that gets made as it filters up through the process, for better or for worse. But I think as a recommending body, there are some things that you should have the ability to kind of say yes or no, this is acceptable. And the mitigation plan seems to be what this commission has the most interest in and the most, applicable skills. So I'm certainly open to other ideas, but that's kind of my thinking about it.
I do have a question. I'm not super familiar with the UDO, but does this mitigation have to be on the same lot or anywhere?
So currently, under the ordinances, mitigation is required to occur on the same lot.
Okay.
Plan Commission can waive that.
Okay.
So they can say that the mitigation could occur, it goes the lot, the sub-watershed, which means
Sure.
Oak Creek, Root River,
Yep.
or in the city. The goal with mitigation is always that the community, the most affected area, get the benefit of that mitigation.
Sure.
So, however, currently, the ordinance requires a factor, so it's 1.5 of units of
Yep.
whatever.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
And so that actually starts to really create a lot of complexity in terms of designing those. So,
Yeah.
and it's also, if we're going to allow off-site mitigation and other kinds of things,
How far
where
does
would
that
that
go?
go
I
is
gotcha.
going to be a big question.
Yeah.
So the city does own parkland. The city has a pretty significant
Yeah.
park area. So that's one suggestion. But there are also several conservancies as well, and they have accepted mitigation in the past.
Sure.
So the short answer is it's supposed to happen on site, but if that's not feasible, Plan Commission has allowed it to happen elsewhere.
Okay. Yeah. As
So.
long as I think, at least for me anyway, as long as it's benefiting at least the city or neighbors or something, because then there's no other point to do so.
Right.
Yeah. And one thing that I would encourage opening it up to is if you have an applicant, you've got a lot who control more than one property, and say there's room to, you've got a really tight site, but there's room to redo the vegetation or add trees or a stream buffer, or to vegetate a lousy detention pond with a good naturalized buffer on another site that person owns or controls, that I would encourage that, so long as you make sure that off-site is protected with appropriate easements and restrictions that are recorded. I'm also nuts from hard experience. I always think a financial surety on bonding for the value of the plantings for 3 years. Again, from a standpoint of business cost, I'm actually thrashing through this with the city of Eau Claire, where we're looking at what's the appropriate amount of bonding for natural resources for stormwater. And there are ways to do letters of credit. There are ways to do sureties with landscapers that are not going to impose a cost that's going to lead to adverse decision making. So making sure that we've got that in the language so that it's super clear that that can and probably should be required for mitigation, I think will also be beneficial.
So in the past, we have, authorized some of these exceptions with recommendations to do the buffers and wetlands. Is there a data to say that it hasn't worked, based on the comments from JB?
I don't have like a study that's been conducted. Some of this is based on feedback from wetland ecologists that we've interviewed during the stakeholder interview process. So there's a few people to do that work. I also know that we haven't gone out and re-inspected any of them directly. But my concern here is that I also know the DNR doesn't really recommend some of the areas that they've been doing this for that work. So we've looked at having actually a wetland bank in Franklin, and that's not feasible on the lands that we would propose to do that. So this is not my area of expertise, but my understanding is that not only is it cost prohibitive, but that depending on the site circumstances, they're not doing well. And if we're not requiring, so there's been a lot of variation in requiring maintenance and sureties. And so if it's not being maintained in some cases, I would imagine they're not being maintained. So that's an interesting question, though. So.
Yeah. I think the folks at R.A. Smith are probably the most knowledgeable about it. I do think that in addition to the financial guarantee, I know that there had been some complex language and performance standards and this and that with some of the natural resource plans in the past that it's just from the get-go was really beyond the capacity of staff to follow up on. Part of the reason some of the language is drafted as it is on stream buffers is because staff can't follow up on every little thing. So things like making sure that a mitigation or a buffer area is fenced and demarcated really make a difference to function and performance. Things like having the green infrastructure have follow the MMSD standards and have like a 3-inch swath of grass at the edge of it, it's going to live longer and be less problem prone. Mary Jo Lang was the DPW director in Cudahy. She beat that into my head for years. Like, protect the edges of things and they're going to survive better. So getting a couple of those pieces of guidance and construction standard in there, we're seeing around the region can really help with function over time. So we want to be clear about that. And you can get a maintenance agreement. It's so hard to make sure that all of them are followed up on, but if you do a couple things from the design standpoint, it does help. It really does help up front. It'd be super interesting to go back and see some of them, Marion. We should probably take a driving tour one day.
I agree. The other sort of open question, there's quite a lot of conservation easements in the city. We require mitigation to be protected under our current conservation easement template and then existing natural resources to be likewise protected. And we don't have a complete map of where all of those easements are, which is kind of on my really long list of mapping projects. But it might be interesting to go take a look.
That's got interns written all over it.
It's got, sorry?
Interns.
That's
W. Whitewater.
a good point.
You gotta find kids to help work first.
I mean, we've got an intern right now, but he's kind of
Yeah.
up to his eyeballs and some stuff. So
Yep. Um, just real quick, shoreline wetlands. The draft UDO has the sort of state mandated language. It's, I really don't think there are any statutory shoreline wetlands in Franklin, but we have so you don't get in jail. We have the mandatory language in the draft of the UDO. And then mitigation guide, again, as much input as you want to give us. We're going to start really working on that this month. And this is the draft of the ordinance. And, you know, this 2B here is the clearing removal of dead or diseased trees, invasives, prohibited, restricted, and that takes care of buckthorn, ash, and other low-value stuff. Basic exemptions have not changed. And the yellow stuff is stuff that we're still working on the draft of, you know, where is that going to be? Surface water and wetland buffers, where I've got stuff in blue, that's, if you're reading through this and you think about, Amy, I think this is a great place for input from you. These are some recommended buffer widths. And, you know, for new development, you want to keep 30 feet is a minimum, 50 in your lower density districts. But where you've got redevelopment, you have to recognize you may not have room to really do a proper buffer, but you could, hopefully you can get 10 feet. And, okay, yellow again is administrative. And then, you know, super interested here to hear if there's any other thought on defining woodland, high-value trees. Really open to input on these. And, okay, lakes, ponds, and streams is pretty straightforward. Delineation is important. And then this is on the floodplain and flood hazard. Right now they're treated as a separate category of resource. And it's sort of like, well, are we trying to, you know, does compensatory storage offset count as mitigation? And it really didn't accomplish anything to define it as a natural resource in addition to its regulatory designation. So that's, we're basically saying any impact to a natural resource feature defined in this article, if it's in a floodway, if you've got a wetland in a floodway and you're going to affect that, which would be dumb, you will have to mitigate and you'll have to meet the standards of the floodplain ordinance. So good luck with that, or maybe redesign your project. Artificial wetlands, degraded wetlands mitigation required. And I've suggested 1.5 times the area affected, but that is up to you for your direction. If you want to go bigger on that, or perhaps have an even higher ratio for sewer pack areas, that's open as well. And then this is where I kind of get on my soapbox. Surface water and wetland buffer standards. If you are developing any site that has a surface water or wetland on it and buffer area on it, you want it fenced, vegetated, and left the heck alone. So that's that standard. And then this is 03, again, the detail of the mitigation plan, proposed disturbance. I'm also really nuts about making sure people delineate the limits of disturbance. Where are you stockpiling? Where are you going to have equipment storage? Where are your temporary stormwater features? And clearly indicating all of those areas and then marking them on the site. so that they don't, oh yeah, oops, we stored our stuff over in there. That's a very good way to protect things during construction. And then here is, again, this is really for your review and thinking, is these mitigation factors. I think a good argument could be made that if you are going to affect a primary environmental corridor, maybe that's an even higher mitigation ratio. Surface water buffers, degraded wetlands, again, you can affect them, you just got to go higher. So these are just placeholder numbers. I think that's really up to you all as policy on the level of mitigation. From a cost standpoint, I do want to circle back to that. Trees, planting a quality tree in healthy soil in Southwest Wisconsin is running about $250 a tree. Quality native landscaping in a good soil runs about $25 a square foot. Bioretention areas planted, designed to the MMSD or DNR standard is about $22 a square foot. And so those vegetation plantings, they can get a little bit pricey, but by not over specifying, you give people room on plant choice, tree choice, and you can keep those costs within the range of what ornamental landscaping actually costs.
So for the mitigation factors, are there some best practices from many of the other cities who have, are on the cutting edge of this type of determination?
That's a really a great question. Working in as many places as I do, it's kind of all over the map. I think, Marion, maybe you and I should pick a couple sites and run these through. Maybe pick a couple of older plans and run them through. Again, the current city requirement to mitigate wetland at 1.5 square feet per square foot affected, that's been really expensive. And you want to discourage those impacts and get environmental benefit, but that's been tough. That has been tough. At the same time, you really do want to discourage impacts in like those primary environmental corridors. Marion, do you think we could run through a couple of sites for the commission and just give them a couple examples of like how much area has to be mitigated? Because I can do cost back of the envelopes off that.
From a previous NRSE?
Yeah. Yeah, like a previous one.
I'm trying to think of an example. The other thing to keep in mind with the current ratio is that you're also required to mitigate wetland buffer. So what ends up happening is that you end up creating an artificial wetland, an additional buffer, and then additional buffer plantings elsewhere on site. So it just kind of balloons. It's
yeah.
Give me a second to think. This is going to take a while to find. So I think it would be most appropriate to look at an example of maybe an industrial NRSE.
What about the one we just approved, Greg Marshall's?
That is a single-family residential lot, and he was not required to do mitigation on that project. The one that I'm proposing to look at is the Wangard development in the southeastern corner. So,
didn't they get an MMSD grant for water harvesting? I think they did.
If Wangard did that, it was separate from their approvals here.
Okay.
We wouldn't regulate
they were
water harvesting.
hold this for like and get like just like how this would look in writing, so that way, because we do have an applicant
Yeah.
for, and
Yeah,
just to be
absolutely.
just
Absolutely.
to get like a scope of it just in like
Yeah.
writing, and so that way we can. That way, then Marion doesn't have to be put on the spot here to try and dig
Oh,
up.
no. I meant for like a future, we could do it at a future meeting. She
Okay.
and I could report. Yeah.
Well, yeah,
No,
that, and just in the
entirely.
interest of the fact that we have another agenda item and people sitting
Yep.
here waiting to, yeah.
No, I'm sorry. That was not my intention. I was thinking.
No,
we-
no,
I think
it's
we will
fine.
We
report
did-
it.
Yeah.
We tend to get down a rabbit hole a little bit too,
It's-
so feel free.
Well,
to
it's a
do
lot
that.
of information, so I don't think anyone's complaining. I'm just saying we're looking at the clock and thinking we probably need to revisit this again, right?
Yep.
Yep.
After we've had a chance to kind of digest and review what we've just looked at.
Mhm.
Yep.
So
So,
I would like
Okay.
to make a motion to table this, or yeah,
um,
until another meeting.
JB, have you gotten kind of the essential questions answered that you needed to touch on for the draft as you're working on it, or
And
if
for the
there's
draft
additional
is-
feedback?
If folks are comfortable with the idea of putting the sciencey stuff and the options in that mitigation guide, that's all we need to know. And then
Yes.
for a future meeting,
I'm
let's work on the ratios and the financial surety language, and we'll be good to go.
Does JB need direction from the council or from this commission, or is she prepared just to move forward as she was kind of planning on with the ideas that you had as far as like the science and like all of that other sort of things just kind of being plugged into the back end of it? Or did you need like actual like a vote for direction?
I think we have feedback to proceed with now. At some point, we will be seeking motions for you recommending, but right now we're reviewing a draft. So, you know, when we come forward and say we think this is close to the end, you know what I mean? Then we'll be looking for motions. So,
I would say within, hopefully what I'd love to do is come back with a draft of the mitigation options and the yellow stuff filled in this draft of the section, and get your blessing to finalize. Because I think, hopefully by end of the summer, by like Labor Day, we need to be getting a full draft moved into the adoption process, because it's just to keep on our schedule.
So, Marion, if we have input that we want to provide based on some of these questions, can we email that to you to forward then? Is that the appropriate?
yep, please
Okay.
individually email me,
Yeah.
not collectively.
Yep.
So, thank you.
Great. Thank you
Sounds
so
good.
much.
Thank you for your time.
Great.
JB.
Thank you, everybody. And thanks, Marion, for setting up the virtual. I really, really appreciate it.
Yep.
All right. Have a good night, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Recording stopped.
Okay. You do have the NRSC on your agenda. I would like to touch briefly on the requirements for the NRSC, item VC, before we hear that, so that you guys kind of know the standards you're evaluating against.
Okay.
Would that be okay?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. And this is a present. Oh,
No, I just have a question. Is this anywhere in the materials that we were sent, or no?
this is a slideshow. I don't believe I sent
Okay,
you materials.
that's fine.
I'm happy to
Have
follow
to
up.
know what glasses to wear.
Okay.
Okay. Where I'm looking.
I just got bifocals, so
Uh-huh.
I'm all set. And I will try to speed through this, but if you have questions, some of this is information that I've shared with previous members, but since we have a new person and we have an item coming up, it's important to make sure you understand The scope of your powers are one of the things that you review is these natural resource special exceptions, but all of this is grounded in our Unified Development Ordinance, which protects natural resources. As I mentioned earlier, that's kind of scattered throughout the UDO, but primarily the natural resource protection standards are in Part 4, so that's the part that says, here's what a natural resource is under this ordinance, and here's the extent to which it's protected. So if someone is in need of a natural resource special exception, meaning they need to do something that's a variance on what's allowed in that ordinance, then Part 10 of the UDO regulates those administrative procedures. And again, those are requests that are heard by the Environmental Commission, Plan Commission, and then Common Council. So where's my slide about this? I appear to have misplaced a slide. So, okay. So the document that you are reviewing that's sort of most essential to this discussion is what's called a Natural Resource Protection Plan. This is required with any request for a land division or a development proposal for non-residential development. So if you're doing a subdivision plat to create a residential subdivision, at that step, the developer would be required to produce a natural resource protection plan, which is both a drawing and a report of where all the natural resources are on a property. We focus on the drawing because it's kind of the most applicable and reviewable thing, but then it should be backed up by a report. In some cases, we primarily just ask for the wetland delineation report. I don't send those to you because those are hundreds of pages long. If you're interested in them and want to see them in future, I'm happy to do that. But I review them to make sure that everything is in concordance with, that the wetland delineation and other natural resource report information matches with the drawing that you then see in your packets. This is a requirement for all development in Franklin. So for residential subdivisions, the developer produces it, so it's not incumbent on those individual landowners or the HOA to do that. It's typically done by the person that owns the land and then subdivides it for sale. For certified survey maps, so that could, and it often does, come down to, a family that wants to split up a lot into 2 or more lots could have to produce this somewhat expensive and complicated drawing. And we require that they have professionals produce that information. So, and then also for site plans. So site plans are required for all commercial development. So if someone's building commercial buildings, manufacturing buildings, an apartment building, those kinds of things, then they would also have to do that for the site that they're doing it on. So it's required with all of those application types. And we then review it for potential impacts. We expect people to tell us, and our ordinances require them to tell us if they're going to be doing that. And there's usually a table on the drawing that looks a little like this, but it would have numbers in it as opposed to just the ratios. But we also check their work. So the natural resource protection standards apply to currently steep slopes of different grades, mature and young woodlands, which is defined by how large the tree is, and do not distinguish between tree species or really shrub species either, like you can occasionally get a buckthorn tree. That was news to me. Lakes and ponds, so water bodies. Lakes and ponds, streams, shores and their buffers, and then wetlands and their buffers. So the rule of thumb when I'm talking to developers about this is if you touch water, you have to do an NRSE. So that's pretty much across the board, 100% protection standard, and that is not changing. What will be required in terms of how you think about it and how far some of those boundaries are is proposed to change under the new ordinance, but under the current ordinance that you're making decisions under, these are what are protected. So I will also note that some of these resources aren't protected just by Franklin. They're protected by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, by the Department of Natural Resources of the state of Wisconsin, by the Army Corps of Engineers. And so as a community that's taken a lot of interest in protecting natural resources and making sure that you protect and enhance the ecology of this community, you have this process, but we also must comport with federal and state law. So this is, you're reviewing under your ordinances, but you can't make a grant that supersedes someone else's permission. So that's a very important thing to know. So a natural resource special exception is when you can't meet those requirements. So if you have to touch water, if you have to cut down more trees than is allowed, et cetera, then you make that request. It's basically to impact a resource greater than the degree permitted in the table we just looked at. It's regulated by Part 10 and requires your review, and there is a form that must be completed. So the applicant answers a set of questions that responses are provided in your packet, and then I produce a draft of that form. I try to get you a full draft beforehand. Sometimes that work happens in the meeting session. I think I gave you a full draft this time, but just in general, this is your recommendation to the Plan Commission. And you may make recommended additional conditions of approval. There are some things that are required under the ordinances that become standard conditions on subsequent recommendations and final decisions. But the Plan Commission then holds a public hearing where they receive information and responses from the public about the nature of how they feel that this NRSE is going to affect them. We do get feedback on them, not infrequently. And members of the public may make that comment, and the commission may consider their input. That input also gets communicated to Common Council when the item goes to them for a final decision. So Plan Commission has some special powers in this situation. They can require bonding, which I mentioned earlier, and they also can add additional conditions or amend conditions that are being recommended to Common Council. But only Common Council can accept and approve what's called the standards, findings, and decision of the Common Council on an NRSE. So that decision is, they are the final deciders, and it is a permanent approval to allow for usually a pretty strictly described amount of impacts. And throughout all of this, the applicant has the burden of proof to show that the request of the exception meets the requirements to receive it. There are also standards in the ordinances to make a request that's related to what is effectively a violation of our ordinances that is then subsequently being restored. So in that case, we look at restoration versus mitigation. So if you're permanently impacting something, you then have to mitigate for it. If you want to restore something that has already been altered, you may also go through the NRSE process. And although we haven't reviewed one during my tenure here, I expect that we'll see a few NRSEs to allow for improvements to natural resources as we start to go forward. There's some conservancies that are interested in doing that. And I'm hoping under the new ordinances there'll be more work in that area. So, but currently the requirement is just you treat it as an NRSE regardless of whether it's resolving a violation or improving a natural resource. So that's kind of the brief overview of what all of this information is supposed to look like. Are there any kind of questions before we jump into the actual application?
Yeah, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
In the packet, the answers that they've provided, number 2, nature of the special exception request after the fact approval of impacts to a wetland buffer.
Mm-hmm.
So, am I correct in thinking that these impacts were created by a prior property owner, or what is this? What is this after the fact?
Okay, do you want me to jump ahead to do, I can do,
Well, and I'm asking specifically to draw back to the UDO question that I
Okay.
asked. Do we have an overlay of where these special natural resource protection areas are? Where is the floodplain? To know like what, because I do, and I could be misunderstanding things, but it does seem like we get asked to do things and said like, well, somebody else did this, like the last, somebody else did this, somebody else did this. So if somebody else did that, how did somebody else do that without having to go through these processes? I mean, there's a number of reasons for that, but how do you protect against that? You have a very clear understanding of where these floodplains are, where these protected natural resource areas are, where they whatever. And I, for one, do not have a very clear understanding of that on a comprehensive overall basis because I'm not. And it seems like a map overlay of that would is it gonna change what we have to talk about here today, right now? Maybe not, but it will educate me and others as we start to look at changing zonings and lumping zonings together, which, you know, is supposed to make things easier. And I agree that it will make things easier, but there was a couple of questions I had in that task force meeting for the UDO that kind of relate to this as well. So I'm trying to zip all that up in my head as we move forward and understand how these things all relate to each other. And that's where I'm coming from with this kind of question.
So I'll answer the question generally. The current property owner of a site that may have been impacted, it's whoever the current property owner is responsible for complying with the ordinances. So whoever currently owns it.
Right.
If that results in an impact to them financially or whatever, where a prior owner had done something that was not allowed, then there are civil outlets to resolve that, but the city must enforce on the person who currently owns the property. So there are examples that I have currently under review where a neighbor has damaged a property and the property owner has complained, but effectively the violation occurred on their property. So we have to work out, because I have to cite the property, not the person that allegedly did the damage.
Right,
So-
okay. So I understand that. So then, to the original question, the after the effect approval of impacts to the floodplain. What does that mean? That it's already been impacted and we're just, we're going back in time to make this nice?
So there will be cases where a natural resource issue has occurred that may not be resolvable, or in future you want to require mitigation. We found out about the violation during a development process. So for example, someone comes in with a proposal for an apartment building and we see the natural resource protection plan, but we have one from a previous proposal and something doesn't match up. The current property owner is responsible for resolving what that looks like and would have to go through the NRSC process in order to obtain approval for those prior actions. But ideally, you could also then require either restoration, that they return it to the original condition, if that is their goal, or mitigation, that they then, if they want to maintain the impacted condition, that they then provide mitigation.
And in this case in particular?
In the item that we're reviewing next, this is a discussion of they want to restore the condition of the resource. So
That was impacted by what?
by the property owner's actions previously. So I believe, and I did not review this beforehand, but I believe that the property has been owned by one person for something like 30 years, or one
Thank you.
LLC.
That's what I wanted to know. Okay.
So,
Yep, got it.
but in general terms, those are actually good questions to you, and I made a note for myself as well that we need to kind of talk a little bit more about what the enforcement process looks like in the UDO rewrite and just in general.
I also think it's important to know if we are dealing with someone who's the person who has impacted this and now they're asking for approval after the fact,
Yep.
or if we're dealing with someone who's purchased a property that someone else damaged and now they're trying to fix it. Do we?
I agree.
Understand
Absolutely,
what
yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's an interesting question, because that is not an infrequent case.
But when you think about what someone should and shouldn't be responsible for, to what level, that matters to me. And I think that should matter to this council. Okay.
Yeah, and so for future reference, we're working through a floodplain violation program citywide, and there's a number of cases where people acquired property where someone put something in the floodplain and didn't obtain permits for it or seek them, and then
And I think that
sold their
distinction is
house.
always good to know.
Yeah.
Like,
Mhm.
I'm the person that did this and I'm asking, or I'm now wanting to do more with it and I gotta comply with the law. Or I inherited this problem from someone else.
Or literally inherited it. Like mom and dad's place in the.
But even
Yeah.
I mean, if you inherited it, yeah. Okay.
But when
If
was
the property's
last time
changed
the
hands,
ordinances
me,
were
yeah.
changed, though?
you're asking a question about what's considered non-conforming, and those non-conforming impacts have legal protection. So if something happened under a different set of rules and was allowed under those rules, there's regulations in the ordinance that allow it to stay that way until someone changes it. So, and that's, you may have heard of the 50% rule. So things in the floodplain, for example, if someone built a structure in what has since either become a floodplain or wasn't regulated, there's then the structure may be allowed to remain, but would then have to come into compliance over time if someone changes it. So,
And that wouldn't be worded as after the fact.
correct. I would be a non-conforming. Yep.
Okay.
So the current ordinance, the bulk of the ordinance was adopted in 1998. It's been amended somewhat extensively. So the natural resource sections, I think, were part of that original. And then this process that we just discussed is the next update. So effectively, we enforce the rules, on the adoption date. When did the application come in? So, yep.
Thank you, Mary.
You're welcome. So I would, and thank you to the applicants for your patience. We had a lot on this agenda. We didn't have a meeting last month, so I'm going to briefly canvass the facts and the city's analysis of this application. And then the applicants are also here, and they'll have comments and also will be available to answer questions. But give me a second to get myself together. Switching gears, and my brain doesn't want to do it. Give me a second.
I'm with you.
Okay. So this request is for a natural resource special exception to allow for restoration of impacts to natural resources on 2 lots in the southeastern corner of the city. It's literally the southeastern corner of the city, with an address of 11027 South 27th Street and then 0 South County Line Road. So literally the southeastern corner of the city. The property was for a long time farmed. This is an area of secondary environmental corridor, and this is the Root River. I will note this is all one lot. So even though it's split by South County Line Road, this is all one parcel, but the discussion that we're having in the work that occurred was north of South County Line Road, so there were not impacts to the river itself, but it gets confusing. This is part of that property. So, okay. So the property was farmed for a number of years, and then in 1999, a stormwater detention pond and golf dome were constructed at this site. And that was an allowed use, and they received a variety of approvals at that time. That facility was demolished in 2018 and 2019, and the site was issued temporary uses, first for the construction and demolition work, and then for a concrete batch plant that was held on the pad here while they redeveloped the Elm Road interchange that now services Elm Road and the business park here. So that was a temporary use. That temporary use was unique. Concrete batch plants are allowed to be under a temporary use for up to 5 years. However, when the temporary use expired, there was work still being done on the site without approvals, and a series of complaints to engineering and planning over time. And then in 2023, the DNR began enforcement on wetland violations. So there's a group of wetlands here. Oops. This is probably the best way to look at it. There's a group of wetlands on the property. This is the natural resource protection plan. So these areas in green are the wetlands. And that process, the city has interacted with DNR a little bit on it, but that enforcement process is separate from this discussion. And so the outcome of it, I actually am not sure what the status of it is at the moment, but that is a DNR question. So the project also, so in the meantime, this property is located in Plan Development District 39, which is the business park, the second business park, the corporate park in the southeastern part of the city, and there is growing interest in the development of these lots. So if you take a look back here, Elm Road is up off your screen somewhat, but this parcel, there was recently a concept review for development of it. These lots are zoned PDD 39, and they're in what's called the gateway district of that planned development district, meaning that they're developable as office uses, light manufacturing, and just generally business park, but of higher quality closer to 27th Street. So the applicants are hoping to resolve this enforcement issue, and so they've come forward to request the natural resource special exception to allow for restoration work. They propose to restore the wetland buffer on site, and they've provided information about how they're planning on doing that with seed mixes. There are steep slopes present, but this red area is a stockpile, so there's a number of steep slopes that are present on site. Those areas are not, they're artificial steep slopes, and so the impacts to them as a result of grading don't require a natural resource special exception. So a couple of other things to note, there was a artificial wetland here that was an exempted pond. It was a stormwater pond. And then in addition to the request that they're making, because there were impacts to the wetland buffer and setback that the applicant applied for, but during review we noted that there are differences between where the topography is and the federal insurance rate maps. So because of that lack of concordance, we need to determine, how do I put this? We've been reviewing the permitting history for this, and it's clear that the applicant has not received approval of that from FEMA. There's a process that is required by FEMA in order to do that, and it does not appear that those impacts were the result of work that received a permit from the city. We're still reviewing the file. So by Plan Commission time, I will have a clear history of the permitting for this property, but at this time it would appear that there was no grading permit issued for those impacts, and I'm happy to provide a certification of that from the engineering department. But the fact remains that the grade differs from what's in the federal insurance rate maps. And so because this application is an attempt to come into compliance with the requirements of the ordinance, there are several paths that could result in compliance for the applicant. And I kind of want to distinguish between the restoration of natural resources and the compliance outcome. I know those are kind of two different considerations. But in the case of the federal insurance rate maps, while they're currently out of compliance, they might be able to obtain what's called a letter of map amendment, acknowledging that that change is appropriate. And then if FEMA allows that, then the request would be to also allow it at the city level, to say, we acknowledge that the grade is X at this time, and are granting approval of that. However, if FEMA has additional requirements, wants them to restore the grade, wants them to provide compensatory storage, et cetera, that would represent a significant difference from the materials that you're reviewing now. And so my recommendation would be that if that's the case, that they have to come back for a new review of those floodplain impacts. So they're putting forward a grade that we've been able to review. We have not evaluated it for its impact to the floodplain overall, and that is something that needs to happen. So if it turns out that it's okay, you could, in theory, recommend that this approval cover that. However, if that's not okay, it would be appropriate for them to come back and seek a new approval. So,
Question.
Yep.
And this might be for the applicant, but I'll ask you first.
Mm-hmm.
If FEMA is still not decided, or that that process hasn't happened, why are we reviewing changes now? What is the reason for not waiting for these regulatory bodies that outrank us to tell you what you need to do and then come to us and say, here's how we want to fix your part?
Yeah, the applicant requested that they be allowed to pursue a conditional approval to allow them to do the wetland work primarily, so because that is something that they are working through the regulatory process. The FEMA process hasn't been started yet, and we have to determine exactly what's required as well. So they're seeking that conditional approval so that they can continue to move on with future development plans for the site. And they should probably talk a little bit more about that as well, but that's my understanding. So
Yeah, can they talk a little bit about that, please?
Yep. So I've finished the bulk of my proposal or my discussion, and there's microphones here if you would like to speak. So please identify yourselves for the record.
He's got to write it down too, so let's go ahead.
I know who you are.
Matt Carey with Pinnacle Engineering Group, 20725 Watertown Road, Brookville, Wisconsin. We're the civil engineer assisting with some of this work.
Can you
What?
spell your last name? I'm
Yeah, I
sorry.
was going to ask that.
Carey.
Go ahead. Ready? Hi, I'm Sam Schultz, SCHULTZ, Von Briesen and Roper. We represent the client. That's 411 East Wisconsin Avenue in Milwaukee.
My name is Jeff Knauf, Knauf, and I'm one of the managing members of Fox Glen Corporate Center, LLC. My address is 3167 Littlefield Court in Pewaukee, 53072.
Did you guys want me to restate my question, or are we good to?
I think it would actually be helpful if Matt walks through kind of the application from
Yeah,
our
if-
perspective and probably answers a bunch of your
Sure, I
questions
mean-
before you ask them.
I think there are obviously two main parts. I think Marion touched on both. One being the restoration of the 30-foot wetland buffers, and then the other one being the floodplain item. I think you stated it nicely about the fact that a conditional approval would be appreciated if that could be set up that way, mainly for the floodplain aspect, because there is a complicated history on this site in general. And I don't know I guess if we could start there maybe with the floodplain aspect. I don't know if the group had a chance to see this drawing right here. This has three separate images. One in the background, the larger one, that is the grading plan from the Golf Dome facility that was constructed in the late 1990s. That does show what the contours, the grading looked like before that facility went in, and it shows what the proposed contours would look like after that facility went in. What is represented by the blue and the green lines is the blue line is what the floodplain was prior to the parking lot and the Golf Dome facility going in, and that correlates pretty well to what was shown in currently today, what the FEMA firm map shows right now. So I think you can piece together what happened was the site was graded out, some filling did occur in that area between the blue line and the green line, and that's what's really showing the discrepancy between the floodplain boundary today. Again, I think everyone up here at this table was not involved with that site at that time. It was 25 years ago. And I think, Jeff, you could state it, but the site wasn't even owned at that time.
Right. We acquired the property in November, I believe it was November, but it was 2004.
So it was after this work occurred. And, in my experience, a grading permit would certainly, and I know everyone from the city's behalf too was not involved at that time, 25 years ago again. But my experience is the city would have had to issue some sort of a grading permit for this work to occur. And the DNR would have had to issue, an NOI, a notice of intent, as well for this work to occur. So I think that's where, if any of this documentation can be tracked down, it would be to the benefit of everyone here today and the other folks at the city as well. And also, in my experience, some of these things start at the city level with respect to the floodplain, and then it's determined, does this need to get elevated to FEMA based on our current ordinance and our requirements? That's how it seems to go currently, and that's kind of where, when we do our necessary due diligence starting off on this kind of stuff, that's where we start, is at the city. And then sometimes you get the DNR involved, and then sometimes you ultimately get FEMA involved. So there's kind of a process that needs to be followed to get an answer to that. But again, I just wanted to kind of walk through the history of this floodplain so hopefully everyone understands that and kind of helps with why we're here tonight. So,
And I think knowing the ownership history helps me a little bit too. I want to clarify for everyone what the process is. So we have what's called a land use permit for under the current ordinances, which is a floodplain ordinance that was adopted by the city. Again, we talked about that appended ordinance that we're going to be re-adopting in October. So the current ordinance requires a land use permit with the natural resource special exception. So in a sense, Matt is correct that this would be the first step, and it does need to get elevated to FEMA. It's not clear to me what type of letter you need, whether it's a letter of map amendment or letter of map change, and I haven't done that review yet. So, but this is one of the required steps for approval, and then FEMA and the DNR would have to do the review against their standards.
So I have a question. The pad for concrete batch mixing, what year was that
you take that one.
put in? Does anybody know?
2018. Our world blurs kind of quickly sometimes. It was during the construction of Elm Street that led on to the new entrance ramp to I-94. So,
Been like 2018 through 20.
I got 2018 as the date on this.
That was the issue. The permit was issued in
2019,
2018.
okay.
2018.
Oh, I'm sorry, forgive me. 20. Okay.
So in 2018, the pad was created.
The permit was issued for the pad.
The permit for the pad. Okay.
The permit was issued for the use. So the pad was using some of the existing grade that was there. So there's, as you can see in the drawing, there's a parking lot that was pre-existed the use. So I haven't reviewed any of the temporary use materials for that use, but it was an approval for the use, and I imagine there was a site plan with it. So
They more or less set up on the site as it existed after the Golf Dome was demolished.
Okay. I'm just trying to get my. And so after the Golf Dome and before the pad, someone came in and changed the topography of the area, or before the Golf Dome?
As a part of the development of the Golf Dome, someone filled in a little bit of the floodplain to create the parking lot for that Golf Dome. And our assumption is that someone couldn't have done that without multiple city approvals. So we're assuming at some point in the late 90s that someone approved that grading plan. But we don't know who yet. Marion's going through the files. Sorry about that. But, the assumption is, kind of doesn't really matter. We are where we are right now, but we know that the existing, we're assuming there was some sort of municipal approval to fill in that portion of the floodplain that never transferred over at that time through a letter of map amendment or a letter of map change to show that on the FEMA firm panel.
So you're asking for it to stay the way it is and then move on with your process to to build instead of waiting to look for the records to be found 30 years ago. You're ready to move forward to the next step and kind of
We just,
for approval.
yeah, kind of like to bifurcate we'd like to get the wetland and fill pile situation figured out so we can reestablish those wetland buffers and get that clear and that issue dealt with the city. You know, a letter of map amendment or a letter of map change can take a year with FEMA or more, depending on how backed up they are. So we'd kind of like to say, conditionally approve us for that. We'll go through the FEMA process, acknowledging that's going to take a really long time. In the meantime, we'd like to get this wetland stuff figured out so we can get that closed and that issue done with the city.
No, you go ahead.
So really, this is very narrow scope as far as what you're looking for. It is the focus is on the wetland restoration, and anything else is kind of noise at this point, and it's background, but it's not what you're here to really like that you're looking for at this
tonight.
Correct.
Yeah, I think we all acknowledge that if there is a needed change, we'd like to, we'll continue to coordinate with the city because these sites are being looked at for, sale and development. It's also likely that larger grading plans will need to be developed, and so we want to minimize the amount of work we're doing and make sure that if we are filling or reconfiguring floodplains, it can be with a fully updated and new grading plan for the final development stage of the site and not have a bunch of temporary floodplain measures and dealing with FEMA until that happens. That's all in the works right now as that concept plan went through. So it's not like we're saying, give us 5 to 10 years. We're just saying in the next year, all of this should come together. And we'd like to do that as one package instead of 16 different approvals.
Well, and I guess that's where I was coming from with saying, why wouldn't you do? I'm recognizing that the FEMA process is probably a lot of red tape and a lot of time. Still wonder, I would rather us deal with the larger pieces and decisions on how special exceptions go when we look at the whole picture. And so you're asking us to ignore this part of the picture and just answer this. And I understand why. I just am trying to
I think ignore is the wrong word. I would say condition your approval on us dealing with that. So we're acknowledging that we can't get rid of it.
Yes, but to not deal with it. So, and that's always tricky because you don't know what you don't know.
Well, I would say on the site, and Matt, you can provide more details. The areas are completely separate on the site, so dealing with the floodplain would not impact the wetlands that we're trying to mitigate. And vice versa. So we can fully deal with the existing stockpile on site, make sure that's regraded and the wetland buffers are reestablished. And none of that affects the wetland area. It's just a discrepancy that the staff caught when they were reviewing the grades on the site.
But would the other bodies overturn or reverse whatever we tell you?
No, because the floodplain area is completely separate. So whatever they rule, the longest situation would be essentially we need to go after a letter of map change, which means reshooting the entire detailed grades of the site, submitting that to FEMA. They do the calculations on its impact of the floodplain and then ultimately issue these new letters. That's why it takes so long. But none of those areas are within the wetland areas that we're dealing with. So they should be completely separate. They're both not close on site and also not close in grade to each other.
Can you see where the restoration would then not require the special exception anymore, where because the wetland has been restored fully, that you would no longer need the exception to be issued for you, or no? Would that be kind of this is going to have to happen for quite a while?
For the floodplain or the wetland?
The wetland. I am not taking the floodplain into consideration because that's not what we're talking.
Yeah, so they're required to go through this process to request approval to interact with the wetland buffer.
Okay.
That is the special exception.
Correct.
Oh, okay.
So I was like,
that's what I was
confused. Okay.
So we have a draft grading plan for the site, and to basically implement that grading plan, we need the special exemption, is my understanding.
Got it. Okay.
Correct.
Yep.
Yep.
I'm sorry about that. Okay.
Just in terms of future development, there are no applications submitted with the department currently. We expect to receive them sometime in the future, but you would not be proactively approving a future natural resource impact. That if they say we want to further change the floodplain, or some drawings I've seen have proposed storage areas, that would still have to come back through. I mean, we're going to continue to enforce our ordinances. So this question is really, we're trying to resolve the restoration issue and then get a conditional approval to allow them to determine what's necessary with the existing grade in order to move ahead. So,
Yeah. I just keep thinking in my head, and I'll say it out loud, that wetlands affect floodplains and floodplains affect wetlands. Every day, all the time, in every situation. And so I get what you're saying is we want to fix the wetland and we don't want to think, but I'm just trying to think, is there any negative side to that? I can't think of one off the top of my head.
Yeah, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, but like the water on the site is kind of the area that we're fixing the wetland is the water's draining to a completely different area than the area that would be draining into that.
Yeah, and the main area where the wetland buffer, just to clarify, it's wetland buffer mitigation, not actual wetland. It's in the area where that's noted as the former detention pond is. That's the area where the stockpile, that's where the filling occurred. So really we're talking on the fringe of that 30-foot buffer. I don't know, Marion, do you happen to have a different drawing that might show it a little bit better? Yeah, that one actually. Where you see the word pond there, that's at the southern edge. That's where a portion of the former Gulf Dome pond used to be. And just north of that is where basically the stockpile is. The most current wetland delineation that was done as of last year showed that area just south of that, where it does say pond, as that is an actual wetland.
Just south of the pond.
Just south of the pond, correct. And so we're mainly focused on the 30-foot buffer just north of that to remove this material and basically restore it to what it was prior. And
Which is what?
Which is just lowering the grade and then reestablishing the correct native seed mix to go with it that meets the ordinance, the UDO for that.
Procedurally, does this have to go back to Plan Commission if it's approved here?
So you're
To
making a
supersede-
recommendation to Plan Commission.
Because it looks like according to this, they approved it back in May.
They did not approve the natural resource special exception. They issued a temporary use as effectively a stay of enforcement on this issue so that the applicants could move ahead with their work.
Okay, so then if we make the recommendation here, goes to Plan Commission, they either continue that along and then that goes in front of council then?
So yes, the natural resource special exception, you make a recommendation to Plan Commission with recommended conditions of approval. There will be a public hearing, and the Plan Commission will then also review the item and then make a recommendation to Common Council, who will make a decision on what's called the standards, findings, and decisions, which is a permanent approval. So the scope of it does matter, which is why one of the reasons why I'm trying to be specific about what the approval will constitute, because if you exceed that, then you would have to come back, basically. So,
And we fully acknowledge that as well. I know you guys have to button it up on the actual language of approval, but we understand the concept that we'll be back probably, hopefully, at least one more time to.
So I just have a quick question. So you have a stockpile of dirt right now that you want to practically grade out, move it, and then restore to your 30-foot buffer, and then have that 50-foot setback. So basically, you're prepping the land for the next step. It's kind of what you're doing there.
For the development.
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So can we motion to vote on that, as in have it go forward, or comments?
Yep, so you would make a recommendation, a motion to recommend to Plan Commission
Got it.
the findings within the document that was prepared for you, this
Okay.
City of Franklin Environmental Commission recommendation with the conditions appended therein.
Got
I
it.
love that word so much. Which these conditions were, I tried to craft them in such a way that they reflect the discussion that we had, that the FEMA floodplain approval is acceptable, but then if there's a lot of changes, that they would have to come back. And then also there's the requirement about maintenance information or guarantees on the restoration plans, a recommendation for construction fencing to protect wetland buffer and setback from further encroachments during your fill work, and then that there be permanent boundaries to protect the wetland buffer on site after completion of that restoration work. And then a future NRSE could alter that. So those are the recommended conditions. If there's discussion on the conditions,
I have a discussion point that would be part of the motion, and that would to be either to add to D or add another letter just that says the applicant shall install construction fencing to protect the wetland buffer and setback from further encroachments during fill work, removal work, and remove the construction fencing once the work is complete.
that makes sense.
Are you taking, did you get that?
Writing it down.
Okay.
Construction fence.
So basically,
Yeah.
it's all of D, but then I would just say, and remove construction fence after the fill removal work is complete.
Yeah, just to clarify, and this was an engineering comment we received recently, but there are 2 rows of silt fence and also the orange construction fence, but that's right up against the edge of the wetland because we have to get into the wetland buffer to remove it, to restore it back to the grade that it needs to be, and also do the seed mix that needs to go there. So is this that location, or is this further out
So
after the fact that gets done?
you need to do the restoration work, but you need to do other grading work on the site.
Correct, yes.
So once the restoration work is complete, maybe we need to amend the conditions that way. Once
Yeah.
the
Okay.
restoration work is complete.
Okay.
Regardless of the wording, what I'm trying to get at is, we see a lot, I see a lot of silt fence left, and the grass is this tall, and the developer's gone. And then the fencing flies everywhere, and the sticks are in the, and I see this over and over in Franklin. And so then it's up to somebody to put a complaint in, to get an inspector to go out there, to go back to the developer, when the developer should just be removing the silt fence once the work, after its intended purpose is completed. And so that seems like it should be obvious, but apparently
Sure.
it's not happening here in this city on multiple sites from multiple. So that's my intention here, is to just clarify that. We do want to make sure
Finish it up.
that it's done. Please,
Yep.
finish it up.
That works for me.
Yeah.
That's the only recommendation that
Is there
I have.
anything else?
No, I'm good there.
Go ahead, did you? So, is there any information on so the grassland mix is what we recommended? Is there,
The
The native-
ordinances require native plantings. They don't specify beyond that, and so the seed mixes, I usually check them for species to some extent, but it's not my area of expertise, so this was the one that they selected for this purpose.
is it
seems
in
fine.
here somewhere? Can you point me to what?
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
Does it
it's
have-
in the larger plan set.
This big thing?
Yeah, that big thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Sure you don't
I'm
want,
just
you want
laughing
11
because
by
we have so much
17s in the
paper.
future?
It's kind
As long as they're legible.
Which one is it in, please? Do you know?
Yeah, it's the hatched area.
Is it on the second page? Maybe?
See the erosion control plan C4 and C5.
Three.
if you see where it says proposed wetland buffer grading restoration area,
I do.
and then it's if you look at the legend, there's a short grass prairie mix that correlates to that.
Short grass prairie mix. That's as specific as we get.
The agricole short grass prairie mix. I believe it's straight from, if I'm not mistaken, I believe it's straight from the UDO.
No, they don't specify. It's just
No.
got to be native plants.
Okay.
So,
Okay, that came.
Forester to weigh in? Oh.
this isn't in his
No.
area per se.
And I mean, I would do a mix of native long and short grass and perennial native perennial flower species. I don't know. I don't think it'd be any more expensive. That's why I'm curious why. So you have more diversity. You're not just doing a short grass, a native short grass restoration.
So we should recommend to the planning commission short grass with the possibility of long grass and perennial
A more
prairie grass
diverse
and stuff
seed
like
mix.
that.
I would just, maybe that's it.
Okay.
Make a recommendation for
Yeah.
more diverse seed mix that includes
More biodiversity.
tall grass prairie
Okay.
grasses and potential native perennial species.
Okay.
I don't think it'll be any more expensive, and I think it's probably so you have like a long, the turkey foot, the big blue stem, and little blue stem, and this is I don't know what's in this mix. It's probably just small grasses. Is there any reason that you wouldn't want a taller grass in that buffered area?
I mean, go ahead, please,
I
because
was just gonna say it's your requirement, so you tell
Well, I'm
you
just
tell
saying
us.
It's not going to be mowed. Another stipulation in here asks that you put like rocks so people don't ever mow into it. And when you have more diversity, you just have a better stand if you get a dry year or a wet year or some kind of disease or insect that comes through and attacks certain short grass species. You've got long grass species that will still continue to. It's just a better idea, diversity-wise, to have a more diverse mix, especially for this big area. You know, we're not talking about restoring just a little strip of something. So I would just suggest that we make the recommendation to find a more diverse seed mix and that we ask you guys to do that too. And I'm sure Agricole is the company that you're purchasing the seed from.
Yeah, and I can consult and confirm with our landscape team, but they're the ones that help looked into that as well. So they can help with a more diverse mix also.
Okay, so I'd like to add that recommendation.
You're gonna need to move your map there.
So we can write it down.
I'm not going to throw it at you again. I was just teasing. Okay,
Right.
So as a commission, we want to recommend that the silt fences are removed after all grading, planting, hydroseeding, whatever you guys end up doing is done. After the grass seed has established and is doing its job of not letting any erode, and to have a diverse grass seed planted to have a biodiverse prairie, whatever you guys want to call it. So I'm going to motion that we vote yes on those recommendations.
I second.
I third?
No, no.
Fourth?
Oh,
Go ahead,
how
yeah.
you vote?
Vote, okay, yes. I
Anyone in
wish-
favor?
Everyone in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Perfect.
Opposed?
Good.
No.
No opposed. Sorry.
Motion carries.
A natural.
Okay.
you'll get the hang of it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's-
sorry. The first one I came to was 10 minutes. I'm like, this is it? I was like, okay. So,
Yeah, we trust
cool.
you.
Yeah,
And
so,
then for clarification, that's fine. Just for
Yeah.
clarification to wrap this up, we would draft this in the form of a letter that
Okay.
you and I will sign
Okay.
and send forward,
Yeah,
correct?
so the
Okay.
draft was in your packet.
But with the updates.
Yeah, and so I'll send out the revision based on the motion that you made.
And then we'll sign it at the
And
next
yeah,
meeting.
if you, no, actually, no, if you
Oh.
can come in and.
Oh, sure.
Well, it depends on how the meetings shake out.
Okay.
But we usually ask that you come in and sign it.
Okay, sounds good.
When it's ready.
Yep.
So, because this has to go to Plan Commission.
Sounds good.
So,
And then, Marion, which plan commission are we on?
woof. The second one in
So what do you say?
July.
Go table, yes?
Is there a motion to accept? Someone says yes.
Hang on, let me double check.
Okay.
Yes,
So you gotta get two.
July 18th.
Okay.
Seconds, and then
I'm coming back from my camping trip early for you guys.
I make a motion to adjourn the meeting.
I gotcha.
You have not concluded your agenda, but you may table. So
The approval of minutes.
B and
from
C. B and
I will
C
follow up with you guys.
Oh, and the
tomorrow.
approval of the minutes.
Oh, gosh,
Okay.
we went way
Yeah,
out
we
of
jumped,
order.
yeah.
Sure.
We
I thought that was
Any
the last
revised
item.
materials at that time?
did a lot of Frogger here.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. 11 by 17s.
I'm
Did
putting
they-
out everyone tablets, but I
So-
haven't gotten
Oh,
there
okay.
yet.
We have
Okay.
Thank you, guys. No, this was great.
Yeah, thank you for the time. Appreciate it.
Yep, yep.
We can talk.
Correct.
Before next meeting, so we probably should do that, right? If we want to.
Talk to me
Thank you,
about
guys.
sizes tomorrow.
Okay.
Some of
Thank you,
them-
gentlemen.
Yep. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Save a tree.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
I got you.
You do have
Okay.
agenda stuff, but you also could motion to continue.
Yeah.
So
Oh, okay. Got it. Yeah. And I was working. I was like, oh, shit. I
What
moved
are the
something.
things that we need to do?
Okay.
So if we want to get back on track, why don't we go back to 3 and the approval of the minutes for the regular meeting of April 24th, 2024.
Where's the minutes of that meeting? I want to look at them before I say.
You weren't there.
Oh, yeah. I wasn't
you
even
weren't there.
That was my first one. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think you missed too much on that one.
So,
Yeah, we tricked you, right?
Yeah, you did.
5 minutes and
so
then.
now the question that you put to the commission is,
Okay.
do I have a motion to approve the minutes of the April 24th, 2024 meeting?
Okay. So do I have permission to
No, a motion.
a motion to approve the minutes of the regular meeting on April 24th, 2024?
I motion.
So, motions, I'll second.
And then I say,
And then you ask, is there any other further discussion?
is there any other further discussion?
No. Seeing none.
None.
All those in favor?
Please say aye.
Aye.
Any that oppose? Nobody.
Motion carries.
Motion carries.
Perfect.
I'll get used to that. I'm gonna have to write that on my arm next time. But
Oh,
all right. So the next thing on the agenda is the review of the articles for the Franklin newsletter. Do we have anything for the environmental commission for that newsletter, or are we empty on that one?
What newsletter are we talking about? The fall?
September issue.
When are those due, Marion? Do you know?
July 17th.
And so we will not meet before
Yeah.
those are due.
Correct. So there's some materials that have previously been distributed that you could link to again. We're going to have some items about the UDO update in the newsletter as well. It's kind of
Without knowing what the previous articles were, my instinct is to say, let the UDO fill the space, and let's not just repeat something because we don't have anything in its place.
I think the UDO is such a big thing, and that is a real, like, that's the gorilla in the room, and
I concur.
that's so important that I think having anything else is, I think having that focus on the UDO is so important. So.
So then I'm gonna motion.
No need to make a motion.
Oh, we're good.
Just discussion.
All right, we're good. Motion
No
move
action.
on.
And then we'll just move on to C.
C. I wasn't there for it. I got stuck working. But how was the Arbor Day event? Was anybody there that made it?
All there.
All there? Yeah. Good. Good.
I think it went. I think it was very positive. I think there was a great turnout from the community. think we went through almost everything.
Very few left.
Yeah, there was very little that was left over. A lot.
Interestingly, it was the shrubs that were left over, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, so people like the trees more than shrubs.
And we made a conscious decision to get more shrubs this time because last time we had all trees. We did have maybe a large shrub, small tree.
Sure.
And we got the comments that I don't have enough space for this. I don't have enough space for this. So we thought, well, let's include some shrubs this year so that people who don't have space for some of these really large native trees
Sure.
can still get a plant. And that's what we have left over.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure what we do next year.
Yeah.
I think it went. I think the formula as far as what was provided was really solid
Yeah.
because it wasn't where this is only what's left. There was a good mix throughout most of the day, and it wasn't where we were hemmed up and only you have 3 shrubs to pick from and that's it. There were trees that were pretty much there all the way to the end.
But sugar maple seemed to be the popular one that went out pretty quick.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Do you for my sake, if we talk about this again for next year, do you guys have a list of what you ordered
So
or what people donated?
No,
City
it-
forester has
yeah.
the
Oh, okay.
So the
Okay.
city forester will bring the options from the city's or the state
Native
nursery.
planters,
yeah.
native
Oh,
plant
okay.
nursery.
It's in your
And then
minutes.
we get to get so many. And it
Okay,
will be in
so
the
there's a record
minutes.
somewhere.
Yeah.
Okay,
So next year we'll be asked, what do you want to do? And we'll probably review what we did
perfect,
last year.
awesome.
And I think the cleanup efforts have been growing, at least in the last 2 years of me being here, of where it was just a handful, and I think it was very consistent where there were other like Girl Scout groups and Boy Scout troops and other just random citizens that wanted to be part of cleaning up Lions Legend Park and the surrounding areas. I think that's fantastic, and you know, and if it continues to grow at the pace that it grows at, that like there's nothing. I really don't see the downside myself.
I don't either. I thought it was a great event. One thing maybe we could do next year to improve, which I feel like we did have a little more of last year, is have an activity or something geared specifically towards children. Families with children came, and we had, oh my gosh, what was the group? The Wild Ones. And didn't we have somebody else
Yes.
that, I can't remember who the other group was. Yeah, they have that acronym.
Yeah.
And they had information, and that was fine, but there was nothing that was geared towards kids. So a lot of times mom and dad will come with the kids, and they always like to pick out their tree, but then to have some kind of maybe little educational activity or something
Sure.
for kids would be, where the previous year, they had that, what was the organization? Was it the sewer district? The
MMSD.
MMSD
Yeah, they had the rainbow
had stuff for kids.
Oh,
They had smaller native plants that they
They
were
had
giving
little
out.
plants, and then they had some kind of activity or something, maybe a drawing or some page I thought my niece brought home.
It was all the sign up and all the literature about the rain barrels.
Oh, and that was
yeah,
a
we
one-time
did that
thing.
for school actually. So I
Yeah.
went to Franklin, obviously, but we did, how they, how we did it for, I think it was Earth Day, but someone donated the blue barrels, and then we all painted them throughout the day, and then it was like either it was a silent auction or like a raffle.
Yeah, that's what they did.
Yeah,
years
and I
ago.
think that
So it'd be
people
nice to
love
have
that
something
stuff.
like
Yeah,
that.
oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember, I was like, damn, I didn't get it because my
Yeah.
neighbor got it.
But it was a great event.
Cool,
Yeah.
that's good. I'm
Yay.
glad.
So no action, right?
No action needed, just a
Yep.
discussion.
And then adjournment. Does anyone have any other comments, concerns, questions?
Can't do that because it needs to be noticed.
Well,
Okay.
I will note for you guys, I put a copy of your administrative procedures in the packet, a physical copy so that everyone has one.
Perfect.
You're also empowered under the municipal code, so I think I printed that out, I don't remember. So they're kind of separate. One is your procedures that the commission has adopted, and then the municipal code is like, here's the scope of your powers. If you guys have questions about that, let me know, but like the most fundamental things are like your regulatory powers are over the natural resource variance process, recycling,
for including
those
I
kind
gotta-
of things. So,
Sure.
Yeah.
and you are also allowed to just table your agenda. I think at 9 o'clock.
And I think
thank
we
you for-
need to start thinking about that. Yeah, gosh.
Well, this was a uniquely packed agenda, but
Is it usually somewhat like this every time?
so an NRSC
No.
is not a common occurrence because
Okay.
they are. We really do
Exceptions.
encourage.
Yeah, 'cause
they're
I'll be
exceptions.
completely honest. I have no idea what I get myself into here. So
Well, you went from like A to B, and it's
yeah,
some of it's going to be intense. The UDO is like really,
Anything with the UDO usually is.
yeah,
Yeah.
so it's ramping up. But
I'm down for it. I'm excited about it.
Yeah.
but you guys do cool, probably the most cool events besides the health department. So, and actually, it might be interesting to have the health department come talk to you about some of the work they're doing around walking and other kinds of things in the city. So.
If let's say, whatever, I had an idea for something, how would I bring that up in a next? Do I email you and you put it in the next thingy, or?
We will work together to draft the next agenda.
Oh, okay.
So anyone can request that an item be placed on the agenda. As the chair, you get to say yes or no to that.
Okay.
So I might occasionally come to you and say, here is something that has been asked to be put on the agenda from an outside source.
Okay.
So people will email me. I capture requests during the meeting. And then if there's something that you want to include for one reason or another, then you do that. And I will make sure that the language is correct.
Okay.
So you can say, here's what I'm thinking, and then I'll make sure that it has all the necessary pieces because the agenda is a public notice of the discussion that you're going to have. So it has to be clear about what you're actually going to talk about, and then if it's not on the agenda, you're not allowed to talk about it.
Got it.
So
Okay.
that's an important rule. And just to remind everyone about walking quorums, I'm sure you all know each other in real life, but please keep in mind that
No, we do not.
no, we do not. Okay.
But anyway,
But don't talk about commission business if there's more than two, and don't reply all to emails.
Okay.
So you should just reply only to staff. So because you can't act on commission business outside of the agenda time. So
And
that
in
is,
public.
yeah,
That makes sense.
yep,
I don't get time for that anyway, so you're good.
great. So
You have
and-
no idea, dude.
Because you're an alderman, right?
Sir.
Oh, I'm sure that's fine.
and I can't make motions, so someone has to make a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
second. That's fine.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? No one says opposed.
Motion carries.
Motion carries. Have
We
a
are
good
adjourned at 9:04
Meeting
p.m.
And that's
adjourned
the
at
time, yeah.
9:04
9:04.
p.m.
Good job, everybody.
I'll
The
get
mic's
that by
on?
the next
No,